Forum Communications, the producer of this fine podcast, has been publishing and supporting local news across the Midwest for over 100 years. And they have named this week Trust Week. It's a week highlighting all that goes into covering local news to ensure we keep your trust. Local news is one of the best ways to stay connected to your community. So during Trust Week, you can get 50% off a new annual subscription to inforum.com. Just visit inforum.news/half off to get this special offer. That's inforum.news/half off to get 50% off local news from local reporters.
Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and listen, it's kind of a story as old as time. There's always been something that's coming for our children. In another era, it was comic books, it was video games, it was violent movies, it's rock and roll music. In fact, if you turn back the clock far enough, and I'm not kidding about this is a real thing, you could read editorials in Victorian newspapers castigating kids for this hot trend of reading novels. Right? They shouldn't be reading novels. It's leading kids to have impure thoughts, etc., etc. There's always, every generation has had a moral panic about its children. And one that we're going through right now, and I think a moral panic is one of the apt ways, one of the accurate ways of describing it, is politicians and activists and just rank and file citizens who are upset about this idea that there's the LGBTQ community and trans people specifically are coming for their children. They're going to indoctrinate them. They're calling it an ideology and everything else. That debate has been going on nationally for some time now. It's certainly been very prominent down in Bismarck during the current legislative session, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. Joining me, along with my co-host, Ben Hansen, is Christy Miller. Christy is a administrative assistant who works in Bismarck, and she is also the mother to a trans human being. Christy, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your life and your child and how you came to this issue, because, and for people wondering why I brought it, Christy has been very active at the legislature, very active advocating on this issue. But Chris, and by the way, I should point people to an excellent article that Christy was a part of by my colleague at the Forum, Patrick Springer. The headline on that is "My Daughter Isn't a Predator. Mothers of North Dakota Transgender Children Speak Out." Very much worth your time to read. Christy, tell us, how did you come to this issue?
I noticed at an early time in my child's life that she wasn't presenting as the typical boy. I'm talking at the age of a toddler. I'm one of those parents who I didn't steer my kids away from playing with anything. I believe that toys don't have to be gender specific. So she was gravitating to her older sister's dolls and princesses stuff and princess movies and clothing. And just like her older sister, we let her play with her younger siblings' trains and trucks and whatnot. So I just thought maybe my youngest was maybe gay and very feminine, and I had no problem with that. Well, in first grade, this same child was assigned with a class to draw a picture of themselves, and she drew a girl. And the teacher called me and said, "You need to come talk to me right away." And when I entered her room, there was the principal, a guidance counselor, and this teacher. And I didn't know why I was called. I thought maybe my child had misbehaved or was acting up.
No.
And she slid this picture to me. And And I'm like, what is this? And she said, well, it's assignment that your child was made to draw, and it actually depicts themselves. And I said, well, my child misunderstood. And she said, no, she had asked my child to do the picture again, thinking the same thing. And my child said, no, this is who I am. I didn't understand or even know anything about trans, so this wasn't a light bulb moment for me. I was kind of frustrated, like, oh, come on, you called me down for this? The teacher broke down crying. And I'm like, why are you crying? I thought, this is homework. I don't get it. The principal and guidance counselor leaned forward and said, well, what do you think? And I'm like, I think my kid needs to redo the assignment. I don't get it. I didn't know what trans, I never even heard the word. So now fast forward to 5th grade is when my child finally had the courage and was able to articulate what she was seeing and what she was feeling. And she told her her sister, and her sister told me. And I have to admit, and I always tell people, I behaved horribly. I was angry. I was upset that, she said that she was a girl trapped in a boy's body. Now, this is 5th grade. And mind you, in 1st grade, he was already seeing this, but a 1st grader doesn't have the means to articulate what they're seeing, what they're feeling, because they're 1st graders. And so I thought, oh my God, I got to get my kids some counseling. But after 5 years of counseling and me listening to someone who's educated and knows what they're talking about, I found out it wasn't my child that needs to be fixed. It was me and my archaic way of thinking. There's a whole spectrum of people of sex between heterosexual and homosexual. And it's not so black and white. And we need to open our minds to the fact that things aren't like we were taught way back when. People used to think the world was flat. We know that's not true. People used to cure diseases by bloodletting and leeches. Well, we don't do that. So people really need to stop thinking that what they were told by their teachers or even behind the pulpit is actually fact. There's a bigger, wider world out there that we are just now really becoming to understand and have for some people, the courage to acknowledge, because this is fear-based. This knee-jerk reaction from the radical right, this is fear-based.
So, Christy, when so now your child has undergone some of the, let me make sure I'm getting it right. Your child has undergone some of the things that now a raft of bills, one way or another, has been seeking to ban. Is that in the state of North Dakota? That's correct?
Correct.
And so when we're saying, I want to, kind of frame this, when, we're saying that you've been kind of active in this session, you've been active in this session, lobbying against these bills. You're not the one bringing these bills forward or pushing for them. This is a response to legislation, right? Correct?
Correct.
Can you kind of, there are many bills, and what I fear when there's, because what do we have, Rob? 19 bills?
21 bills.
21 bills. 21 bills around a single issue. And for, comparison and context, there are many bills, such as the prescription drug price controls, that only have one bill that enter one chamber. Yep. So this topic was deemed, it was deemed necessary by those who were there, by their prime sponsors and their co-sponsors, to have 21 separate bills addressing these. Now, not everyone addresses the exact same aspects of this. Some go into areas like pronouns being used by someone. Some go into procedures and getting into the doctor's office, rather. I'm curious, can you kind of summarize your time in the legislative session? Have you had time to physically be there in Bismarck? And if you have either done that or emailed or called legislators or prime sponsors, what's the response been? Have they been willing to speak to you about these bills?
Some of them have, but what my experience is, and I have gone to the Capitol and I have approached legislators, I have called, I have left voicemail messages, I've sent emails. I've sent them emails with attachments showing not necessarily the medical part, because I try to stay away from that. I speak of my experience, and yes, the medical experience that my child and I am aware of, but I let the medical profession speak on that specifically. But I've had a few, like Murdahl and Koppelman, speak to me, but when they find out that I'm a mother of a trans, they won't meet me. They totally shut down. I've had Boehm from Mandan talk with me, and when we've had an exchange or a discussion, if you will, when he realized that he wasn't getting any ground with me using his religious aspects and his, we're protecting the kids, then he verbally attacked me. And that that's becoming out of frustration because they're not gaining ground. Because when I present the facts, when I present my experience with my child, they don't want to hear that, because now all of their thinking is wrong. He was saying that in response to, and this is fact, trans people, when they're in utero, their body, all babies' bodies form first. And then lastly, the brain forms. And this is what Mayo Clinic told me, because I'd taken my child to Mayo. Mayo told me that they believe that when the brain is forming, the mother's body has a surge of hormones that switches the brain formation from male to female or vice versa. So it comes that the body is not in sync with the brain. Now, that the genitalia isn't just the only sex organs, the brain as well is a sex organ. And so when my daughter looks in the mirror, her brain is sending signals, female, but yet her autonomy, or not autonomy, her anatomy is not that of a female. And so they're just not in sync. It's really that simple, but yet these guys don't want to hear that. Because when I tell them, when I say my child's born this way, they're like, well, no, you've indoctrinated them, or the medical profession's indoctrinated them. And so when I told Boehm, why would Mayo Clinic, a world-renowned clinic, have a dog in this fight? They're there to help people. They're there to do no harm. In fact, all of the medical profession take that oath. And that's when he got personal.
One thing that's frustrated me about this, talking about, what you're describing there as an ugly interaction with a state lawmaker. One thing that's really frustrated me about all of this, as a limited government conservative, is that we're talking, a lot of these policies represent, to me, big government. I'm not really interested in regulating people's lifestyles or their choices. I don't have to like them. I don't have to approve of them. I could go to my church and think that they're sinful or whatever my personal feelings about them are. I think that it's really up to them, and I guess if I want to have my say and exercise my First Amendment rights or whatever, that is what it is. But when we're talking about the government intervening, that is big government. Now that being said, I do think that there are some valid policy debates that we need to have about this. Transgenderism over the last, I don't know what you want to say, however many years, has come out of the shadows in a society that in a lot of ways is organized around gender. So there are some debates I think we have to have about bathrooms. Are there ways that we could do bathrooms that would make everybody more comfortable? I mean, you go to Europe, some European countries, their bathrooms, although unisex, the individual stalls are a heck of a lot more private than what we typically see in public bathrooms in the United States. Is that something we should be thinking of when we're building new buildings or refurbishing old buildings? Yeah. I think that stuff like that's valid. I think, stuff about sports participation is valid, right? I mean, how do we handle some of this? I don't know that there's easy questions. But what's frustrated me is I do think we need to have some policy debates, even about like surgery. I am really, as much as I'm live and let live, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of minors getting medical intervention that has permanence, like surgery, that happening to minors. I don't even think minors should be getting tattoos. So, I think some of that stuff can wait till adulthood. I think there's a valid debate to have. I guess the point I'm trying to make is we're not having meaningful policy debates or valid policy debates. This feels like it's just people who are in the grip of a moral panic. Getting back. Does that make sense to you, Christy? Am I guess from your perspective, am I on the right trail here?
Well, no, you are. But here's the thing. we're presenting, and a big group of us here in North Dakota, the facts. First of all, fact number one, kids can't have surgeries under the age of 18. They have to be an adult. These bills that are out there saying, well, we're legislating that, making sure that doesn't happen. It already doesn't happen. Again, best practices are already in place. And to go further back, this isn't a new thing. Trans people are now just finally feeling comfortable and not so scared as to come forward. Trans people, the Native Americans have a name for trans people, and it's Two-Spirit.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look back in other cultures, they have different names, and these people are held in high regard.
It's been with us for a long time. Yeah. I mean, my point was it's starting to come out of the shadows. It's been with us, I would argue, for about as long as human beings have been around. It's just unspoken. Right. It's been a hidden part of history, if you will.
Now, as far as the sports thing, my daughter has gone through some of this stuff, and as far as hormones and whatnot, her Mayo Clinic was, and it was our choice. No one's ever made us, took the medical intervention at the right time. She did not produce any of the Adam's apple, the facial hair, deep voice, none of that a male would have starting puberty. And that's when they do it. They don't do it to 8-year-old kids. They wait. My child had bone scans of her hands and legs. She'd gone through a battery of medical tests and psychological tests at Mayo. So when the experts say, okay, if you want to go forward, now is the time. And so with the blockers, yes, you can't be on them indefinitely. There's a window of time when you can be on that. But the blockers prevent the muscle mass, and that's where these sports things are going at. Oh, we're going to have our cisgender girls up against these burly boys who now say they're girls. That is so wrong. My daughter has less muscle mass than I do, and I'm a farm girl from North.
There are examples nationally of where you're seeing I guess, and I apologize if I'm not using the right terminology, but a biological male who transitions and then is competing and is dominating. That does happen. I think we can't pretend like it doesn't.
Okay, that's at the collegiate level, and they do have guidelines and specific, and they've even revamped that. But here's the thing. I question that person, because when I looked at the timeline of that swimmer you're speaking of, the 1 year that they were competing as a male,
is it Leah Thomas? I think that's the name. I'm forgetting the name now.
It could be. I forget. But when that person started competing with the males, and then that following year they were competing with the females, that timeline doesn't add up, because my daughter had to be in blockers as a young person longer than a year. And when I've pointed that out to a medical friend of mine, I said, that timeline doesn't add up. Because they look at the blood, and they take blood, and they look at the hormones and the level in there. And then once they get to where it's non-detecting, then they introduce the other hormone. That's longer than a year. And so for my child, so as an adult male or female, however you want to look at it, depending on what they were born as, that timeline doesn't add up. And I red flag that. And the reason I red flag it is because there's so much crap out there that's being said about our kids, bold-faced lies, that I do, and I know this sounds kind of radical, wonder if that whole story is just something made up to make trans people look bad. I really believe that, because the timeline doesn't add up. Now, of course, because of HIPAA, we can never know unless when this person started hormones and how long they were on them before they even competed as a woman. And you think that the coaches would have said, well, wait a minute, But of course, HIPAA, unless that person wants to disclose stuff, you can't. And I do believe every person has a right to their own medical privacy. I don't want to take that away, but there's guidelines, and we have to just know that there's people out there that will take advantage of any situation for whatever reason, but that numbers are very small, and eventually the truth will come out in those kind of situations.
Christy,
trans kids.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm saying trans kids typically aren't wanting to be in sports, especially the trans females. The numbers are very, very small. So there isn't a big threat of erasing girls' sports or, these males coming into girls' sports because they can't compete with the males. That's something that Murdaugh likes to thump and say, this is happening. I'm protecting our kids with using Title IX. Well, Title IX is based on 21st or 20th century, 1970s medicine. And we're here to say there's 21st century medical stuff that things to look at.
Yeah, Christy, when you were talking about those individual legislators, so Yana Murdaugh is a state senator from North Central North Dakota. In Edinburgh. And I wanted to kind of get into your interactions again here with the legislators. Now, and it would almost sound like I was kind of harping on the point, but to Rob's point, when the state government is proactively creating laws that impact an individual and regulate, ban, or deny things for an individual that, certainly haven't been, in your case, would certainly not be asked for by you. And then I'm wondering who is asking them for that. I'm wanting to know what it's like. So you had said that some of the prime sponsors, now you referenced Representative Ben Koppelman of West Fargo, then Senator Murdaugh, and who was it you said from Mandan again?
Keith Boehm, I believe.
Oh, Keith Boehm.
Okay. Is he a senator or a rep? I can't remember.
Senator. He replaced Jessica Bell.
Okay, so Senator Boehm from up by that, Underwood area north of Bismarck. I did want you to get it because I think it's worth people hearing when they think about interacting with their state government, or sometimes there's an impression I've gotten from people who haven't ever interacted with state government that there's this iron curtain there, or they can't interact with them. It doesn't sound to me like your interactions were positive, but like what do you mean when you're talking about like being verbally attacked, or can you? And I'm sorry to poke and prod at this, but I know questions will come from it. So like let's get into the kind of specifics here. You were there to speak to them. Were you able to like go to their desks or speak to them in the hall, and then just the interactions turned sour? Or were you in committee?
Well, no. Actually, when I'm in committee, when I'm speaking, no one ever asks me any questions. It's because I'm a threat. How are they going to tell me that my experience is wrong? They can't. It's been with calling on the phones. Every time, like I met with Dwyer in the hallway. He's my representative. I've actually was graciously granted time with Lefor, meeting him again today. In fact,
so that'd be Representative Mike Lefor, who's the leader in the House
Majority Leader.
Yep. There's a few of the GOP people that say they want to learn and they want to engage, and we, especially as parents, want to hear their concerns, because then we can address what the really issues are. We want to get a dialogue going, like you said earlier when you guys said that we need to have a dialogue, because we believe that's the only way that any understanding and coming together, meeting of the minds, if you will happen. But there's a sect out there. There's a small group out there, and some of them are the bullies out there, like the Murdaughs and the Koppelman, that go out there, and when they find out a GOP person didn't vote their way, they will verbally attack them. Why'd you vote that way? Or getting pretty liberal. And I've had people tell me, GOP members tell me that. Now, when
I'm sorry, what I gotta, because I'm not quite catching you there. You're saying their fellow caucus members are telling them that they're getting too liberal? Is that what you're hearing from them?
Yeah.
And are they talking about like constituents in their districts are disapproving of their votes, or is it just their fellow caucus members?
No, they're talking like, hey, they want them to follow party lines across the board. And so when GOP members have like, nope, this is what I believe, this is what I'm going to do, they've been approached by the GOP members saying, why'd you do that? You shouldn't have voted. Why aren't you staying party lines? You can pretty liberal, aren't you? And I'm like, okay, why is this a party thing? It should be an aspect of what this bill is all about.
Well, I can bolster some of what Christy's saying right now. I have been a conservative voice in North Dakota for 2 decades, and I have been outspoken on this issue. I don't understand why we can't. I mean, something like pronouns to me just seems like good manners. I don't understand why we're doing all this. I've been attacked on that front. I'm called liberal all the day because of my stance on this. I also talk with a ton of these Republican lawmakers who tell me they're afraid of voting for against these bills, or to say back up the governor's veto. And Ben, we've talked about it on this show before. Christy brings up Senator Keith Boehm. Keith Boehm beat Jessica Bell in District 33 in the primaries last year. He beat her at the convention. He beat her in the June primary. And the issue he campaigned on was her vote to sustain Governor Burgum's veto of last session's transgender sports bill. So they're very much afraid that votes on these issues can cost them an election, which is why I was kind of amazed that the House sustained Governor Burgum's veto of the pronouns bill earlier this session, although that language has been brought back by the Senate in another bill. And not only did they vote to sustain it, they actually had, by my count, 4 fewer votes for the bill than they had when it passed originally, which speaks, maybe there's some minds changing out there. I don't know. But anyway, Christy, I guess what I was doing is I was adding my experience to yours. What you're describing is very real.
Oh, yeah. Well, and so the personal attack, which you asked earlier, was him getting personal by saying, well, when your child gets older, how are you going to explain that what you did to your child? And I'm like, wait a minute, you're assuming that my child didn't know what was going on.
And that was Senator Boehm? That was Senator Boehm who said that?
Yes. My child knows what was going on. The whole step of the way, my child's never been kept in the dark about any of these decisions. The medical staff, professionals, and I, and especially me, would bring up this topic and talk. Do you understand what this means? What do you feel? You got any concerns? And then he went on to say, well, that because unfortunately, sometimes with medical intervention, when you intervene, something else happens. Like let's say I told this to Keith, because my child is sterile, and that's unfortunate. But here's the thing. I have a living kid. I have a kid that is alive, that didn't run away from home, that didn't get on drugs and alcohol, didn't kill herself, because I helped her become who she was. And those things are real. Those things do happen. But with anything, as you hear in the commercials, there's side effects. Well, this is unfortunately something that has happened and does happen. But like I told Keith, if your child had bone cancer and you had to either save your child by cutting off their leg or letting them have cancer, what would you do? And he goes, that's different. I said, no, it's not, because if I didn't help my child, odds are she would be dead, or her life would be totally different than what it is now. My daughter is a success story, I call it, because she's happy, healthy, thriving. Her mental health is in a great state where it could have been if I didn't help her and she didn't get the intervention that she needed. She is now in her 20s, and I asked her, do you feel like you made the wrong choice? Are you happy with being, are you still trans? Because I've even had people say, well, your child isn't trans anymore. Yes, she is, and she just laughs at that. She goes, yes, Mom. And then she just laughs because, there's this falsehood out there that as parents are, making our kids, and what do we gain by that? And when I ask people that, they just kind of look at me. But also a lot of these legislators, I've asked them first thing, how many trans people have you talked to? How many parents of trans people have you talked to? And they haven't. And it's because they listen to the Fox News. They listen to the people behind the pulpit. Murdahl was a director of this Women's Concerned Women of America, North Dakota chapter. And I'm like, you don't speak for all women, because I'm not threatened by a trans woman. These insecurities and narrow-minded people need to get over itself, because, quite frankly, the world doesn't revolve around them, and they need to open their minds and frankly their hearts, and realize that God put all of us out there. He added us all different, so we can learn from each other. Well, I call it like a spice rack.
I want to interject something. I know Ben's got one last question, but Christy made what I thought was a really good point. I don't know, and I'm not a medical professional. I'm a guy who writes about politics for a living. So, but I'm also a student of history, and I know that over time, our approach to medical situations or even psychological situations, they they change. And I don't know. I think a lot of times we do things and maybe they aren't the best way, but we're doing things the best way we understand, but we get better at them over time, right? So I don't know if all the decisions we're making with regard to trans people are the best decisions right now. I think people are trying to make the best decisions, but I also know I'm also allowing for the fact that as our understanding of this grows, we could get better at it. And we could find that some of the things we're doing now are mistakes. That might be a real thing in the future. I don't know. But I do know that the only way we're going to get better at this stuff is if it's out of the shadows. And if it's out in front, and if we're having honest discussions about it, and we're acknowledging, and that's, again, what frustrates me is there are people who I think we can just shove this back into the shadows and pretend like it doesn't exist and use the force of government and the awesome power of government to make it seem like this community doesn't exist. I think that is absurd. Anyway, I just want to make that point. Ben, go ahead.
The data collection bill is doing just that. If it passes, because they don't want to collect any data on trans people at all. And that is ridiculous because these people do exist. Just because you deem it not in the state of North Dakota doesn't make it so. If you want to collect stats for the state, you want to get all the real data so you can do whatever you're going to, the means for the stats collecting. But trans people are out there and they should be counted just like cisgender people. You can't erase them. But Casper out of Fargo said on his Facebook page he wanted to erase queer from the state of North Dakota.
Well,
that's the mindset.
That's Representative Jim Casper from Fargo that she's referring to. Ben, I think you had a last comment, and we got to wrap things up.
Yep, we do. Christy, I appreciate you getting specific with your interactions there, because something that I do as a guest host, I need to get away from, and it's maybe not even, well, it's not necessarily fair to you as someone who's simply representing themselves, but I'm in a habit of saying the legislature, and it's not accurate. There are individuals in the legislature who are prime sponsors of these bills. The bills don't just magically crop up. Individual people have to choose to do that, and they have a responsibility to say why they are doing that. And I appreciate you coming here, being on the record, being willing to respond. Sounds like you've had quite how to put it. I don't want to say adventure, but I'm appreciative that you're willing to step up and represent people like your daughter in the way that you have, because it's not easy. It's time consuming, and there's a lot of personalities to navigate there when you have a state government there. Now, I want to ask, where do you go from here? You're waiting on seeing where the governor comes down, and I did want to ask, we don't quite have time if you had interactions with the governor's office, but where do you go after this session? Are there a group of parents like yourself? Is there an association that you're working with to try and do something maybe proactively in the opposite direction next legislative session? Is there something you're trying to do on a city level, or is this just all your energy is being used up by responding? Where, I want to speak for you though, where are you at after this session?
We have spoken with the governor's office. We after 1298, that was a sports bill 2 years ago, was vetoed. We knew that it was going to be ugly 2 years from now, which is now we're going through. We never expected 21 bills, but we decided to form a larger group, more so we can get communication between ourselves. And this group meets every Tuesday, and we talk about what's happening at the Capitol and what we can do to either get in front things or who we can talk to. It's great because it's also supportive. And so it's not just of me as a parent, but there's organizations out there, Human Rights Coalition, Dakota Outright, ACLU, I mean, a bunch of us doing efforts because we want equality for everybody. And the governor's office is great. We do know we got work, so we're going forward. We know until we get equal rights in North Dakota, this is an ongoing fight. Because I do believe once they work on our trans kids, then they're going to work on the trans adults, and then they're going to work on the gays, and then who next? And I've asked legislators, who's next? Are you going to go after ethnic people? Because what do you want, North Dakota to be an Aryan state, just all white? I mean, this is very Hitler-like stuff that they're doing. It's out of his book, Mein Kampf, and I find that really distasteful because in one of our legislators, I believe it was Tweet, who had said he believes in freedom of speech. But when I was on the phone with him last week and he brought that up, I said, well, wait a minute. These kids with the pronouns bill, they have freedom of speech. He goes, no, that's different. The GOP are so hypocritical. It is pathetic.
Well, let's. I mean, again, when you're saying the GOP, remember the GOP, which controls the House of Representatives, just sustained Governor Burgum's veto. So it's not all Republicans.
It's not. You're correct. And there's some great ones out there who said, we're tired of these, like Eric Murphy. We're tired of these bills.
Yeah.
I didn't come to Bismarck to govern people like this. So most definitely, and I, as just, Joe Public here, this is my second time dealing with the legislature. I'm learning myself. I'm pretty much a moderate person. I vote on what the person says, not political party lines. So my ideology of what the GOP has shifted to, because like you just said, we got some open-minded GOP people there who want less government, and they see this as an overreach of the GOP. And I've brought that up, and they're like, well, yeah, you're right. And I'm talking to the ones who we try to reach out to the ones who want these bills, but yet they're not quite sure. So I call them fence sitters. And so when I engage with them, they see what I'm saying, but yet there's always this hesitation. And I think it's because of what their colleagues will say.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Christy, we got to wrap it up there. I really appreciate you coming on and telling your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You guys have a great day.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Well, just finished up our interview with Christy Miller, and that was it's hard to hear sometimes. And I say this as a Republican. There are elements in the Republican Party, and it's not all. And I felt the need to correct her, because I'm a big believer in when people you disagree with do the right thing, you gotta give them credit. Right? I mean, otherwise, what incentive?
And you gotta talk about people individually too. Because to your point, that's why I said, I have a habit of doing that too, where I just say the legislature, and and honestly, for me, it even goes both ways. People say, well, I can't believe the awful things this legislature is doing, and very frankly, as someone who's pretty much identifies with the Democratic Party, it's like, well, okay, there's not necessarily this bill, but on individual bills, it's like, okay, well, every member of the small Democrat caucus voted against that. So saying the legislature is not actually accurate. It's this many people. But to your point, Rob, if you can tell the passion in Christy's voice too, and she has, and I'm glad she has. So she's looked up quite a bit and is able to create to summarize the narrative for folks who don't know it, which I'm thankful for. I wanted to get into exceptions within the GOP caucus and hear more about her meetings with I was encouraged to hear that Representative Mike Lefor had taken time to meet with her, because he had told, I can't remember, it was the former whomever, we need to understand trans individuals' lives more, and we need to get educated on that. And I'll admit, when I read that in the paper, I was like, that strikes me as hollow. What does that mean, Mike? And I'm glad to hear that he's at least taking the time to take the meeting, because he's a busy man. It's not easy being majority leader. I'm not ever saying these jobs are simple. But I'd love to break down the individuals, but I'm glad we also got to hear from her about people who either went silent on her or, decided to, from what I gathered from her, insult her when they were
or to talk to her in a disrespectful way, which, by the way, I don't care. When you're an elected official and a constituent comes and maybe she doesn't live specifically in this person's district, but I don't know, when a member of the public's talking to you, at the very least, you owe politeness. And honestly, if you don't have anything nice to say, then don't say anything at all. I would prefer silence than to you being rude to a member of the public. But
if you're going to take it personal too, as a legislator, you're in the wrong business. Right. You're going to interact with people that don't agree with you, and they're not going to agree with you on this bill, and then on the next bill they might. So don't burn bridges. you need to keep your powder dry. And I believe who she was speaking to as a freshman, but that's not an excuse. You got to learn that one fast when you're in government, because you at the end of the day, you are writing bills and making laws on how people have to live their life at risk of legal penalty. That's a big problem with a lot of these bills, even when the legit concerns come up, like the ban on, it's talked about being surgeries. That bill originally was written, and I think it remained or was killed, saying gender affirmative care. It didn't say surgeries.
So that's even like psychological or psychiatric care.
It's like literally sitting down and talking to somebody. Right. I think a psychologist about. It's like we're going to
even the pronouns bill. It's like, well, we can't train our teachers for how to handle trans students, right? I mean, at the very least, we should want our teachers to be able to approach those situations with kindness and love. But we're not even allowed to help our teachers get better at that.
I can't imagine it's hard for me to accept an argument that there was good faith in the bills that are just policing.
I think a lot of it was like that. I think a lot of them.
The one that Senator Clemens put forward was like, we're going to test your blood. Yikes, dude! You're gonna send in the state to test my blood, and I'm not making that up. That was the language of the bill.
Yeah, this from the same people who are upset about the government testing sewage for COVID, right? Remember when everybody was up there? Boy, I about cursed there. Everybody was flipping out because big government's gonna come and test our sewage, but now we're gonna test people's blood over this. Yeah, and I mean, again,
the tinfoil hat crew seems to change their tune when the tinfoil hat comes from a different brand.
That's exactly right. I started that discussion saying that this is a moral panic, and I think that's what's motivating a lot of these bills. It's people. I hate to trivialize it, but I don't think I am trivial. Art is important too, right? So when they were coming after comic books, when they're coming after books,
when you start accepting, you start accepting. It's not okay.
It's a moral panic. They think everything's terrible, and they don't want. I mean, listen, these people exist in the world, and I'm not even asking you to like it. I'm not saying that your church has to take this position. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is that society belongs to all of us. The government belongs to all of us. The public schools belong to all of us. And we have to accommodate everybody, even people you don't like. So
and the accommodation here is simply not using the government to enforce bans and legal penalties on people in this case. That's where I get very tired and very unaccepting of the ability to accept that these even came from good faith places. And and I wanted to hear from, and so according to Christy, we weren't getting asks of these legislators from their constituents or their districts. It was more of what we've talked about many times, and a criticism that's being levied right now. This is coming from social media, from national organizations, or from cable news. It's a national narrative, whereas the intent of state legislatures is to have seasoned debates on mill levies and flood protection, how we're going to do water mitigation. Should we have a meat packing plant in the state of North Dakota? Should we have a state-owned bank? And I don't say those things to be like, oh, haha, I wish everything was boring. Those boring things matter a heck of a lot to the people whose lives they're directly impacting. And when you're spending time on these bills, when the oxygen gets sucked out of the room so that people who want to make good faith arguments or put their nose to the grindstone to run for public office in the first place get discouraged to do so, you have a poorer result. And that is default of the bill sponsor.
I thought some of the most interesting things she said was about when I brought up the Leah Thomas situation. And I was surprised at how, she felt like that makes trans people look bad. And I agree. It doesn't help when you have somebody who represents I think that's a real problem. If people can change their gender so cavalier and then go in and just dominate a female sport, I don't think that's fair. I think there is a basic, and we have to figure out how to make that fair. And I realize that's a hard debate to have, but that is a valid debate. But she was saying that she thought Leah Thomas might have been. This is her opinion, that she feels like that's somebody.
She came back on you. She gave you a timeline. I don't know anything about that.
Who said? Leah Thomas was just declared the Woman of the Year by ESPN.
Okay. Show you how much.
That's tough. I think some of the stuff that's happened, from the trans community with J.K. Rowling, who I think has articulated. I don't know that I necessarily agree with it, but has articulated a position that allowing men to become women, allowing, maybe I'm not putting this in a very sophisticated way, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I mean, she has articulated what I thought was a very thoughtful argument, saying, what does it mean for feminism with this, right?
I've seen, and I haven't studied, but I have seen her arguments. I have seen direct quotes. I don't think it's particularly articulate. I think she casts a very broad net, and she keeps not. She keeps not distinguishing. But
when I see trans people burning Harry Potter books, or I have a problem. Yeah,
there's gonna be a reaction anywhere. But what I will say, as far as like the sports debate goes, or individual bad actors, that's not what these bills in the state of North Dakota are.
That's fair.
And when we get into, again, testing blood, pronoun bills, any kind of banning any kind of care, we know better than those doctors. That's not the same. And you can do the same with anybody. You can grab bad apple. If we want to talk, the equivalent would be corporate farming law, farmers union, folks wanting to keep, if you call it family farms, you call it corporate farming, talk about LLCs versus whatever. And then somebody comes in and says, yeah, well, this one chicken farm's a corporation in the state of Kentucky and they were bad. Therefore, this whole bill's bad. We can't even have this debate. So there.
Yeah.
It's the best faith argument that carries no water.
You can't make policy based on anecdotes.
There's one scary story somewhere, and one person was a bad person in another state.
That's what they've been doing with the book ban bills, right? Where it's like they hold up this one book that is clearly pretty salacious. It pretty clearly doesn't belong in a children's library, and they say that because this book was found in this singular library, we have a national crisis that requires this very broad language that would ban all sorts of books, not just the very provocative ones. So anecdotes are poor fodder for policy.
Sponsor of that bill, and you're not willing to engage with a person whose literal family is directly impacted and has had a journey that you are proposing to ban, clearly by the interactions, I would say have not bothered to consider. You're beyond not doing your job as a legislator. That to me is like being an architect and scribbling down your designs on your building on a mustard stain napkin. Do some research. I want to hear where in North Dakota this need's coming from. Even if I sponsored bills when I was in the legislature, mostly technology regulation bills that I saw like, oh, you know what, West Coast is doing this, we should get ahead of it, or create a regulatory environment that allows a technology to happen in the state. You can anticipate that, but that's not getting into people's lives. Not what we're talking about.
The last point that I want to make, because we only have a few minutes left, is this is a culture war issue, and this is a moral panic. I would just caution both sides, the other side too, because we spent a lot of time talking about bad actors on the right here, and I kind of bringing up some of these other examples. That was the point that I was trying to make. If you don't want it to be a culture war, then don't fight a culture war, and that goes for both sides. Like, you can't. Faye Seidler, who's a trans activist, a trans person, lives in North Dakota here. Her and I, and she's been on. She does activism background. She writes a lot of letters to the editor. She and I have had a correspondence. She's helping me learn about this issue. I've given her some advice on how to argue, articulate effectively. One of the things that her and I both agreed at is you can only make peace with your enemies, right? The only way you're going to win on these, for the trans community to win on some of these bills, is to win over a lot of people who disagree with you. And you're not going to do that by comparing them to Adolf Hitler. You're not going to do that by saying horrible. And now, there are some bad actors that it's fair to be critical. I'm not saying you can't criticize. What I'm saying is you have to be fair too, and you have to be open-minded, and it can't be this constant thing. Well, because we're debating this bill, you're victimizing me and everything else. I would say the other side has a tendency to do that, to immediately play the victim and try to shut down debate. Now, I'm not saying anybody in particular, but that happens, and that's not helpful either.
Yeah, and that's why I was asking what's next for Christy, because I was wondering if she or maybe a group, an association of parents, and again, I bristle at even saying this a little bit, because at the end of the day, what's happened is she had her life, her daughter has had her life, they've had their journey, and now the state legislature is saying, we're going to ban this, and we're going to get involved in your life. They didn't ask for legislation, they weren't poking anybody else, and now the state government's coming to them, and now it's kind of being put on her to lobby against it. Now, you could talk to a lot of business owners that would say, hey, same thing